Good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Economics and also on the Danube Institute. But before that, I have to introduce the co-organizer, John Sullivan, who will be the moderator this evening. John is not only a co-organizer of this event, he is a very important person. He was a special advisor in for Margaret Thatcher, and author of important books, and including the President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, which is translated into Hungarian, as far as I understand. And also a very frequent author, if I can use this term, for the national interest, new criterion, commentator, and most importantly, the Hungarian Review. And then I would skip some of the chapters of his life. He moved a year ago or so with Melissa to Budapest to set up the Institute of the Danube Institute. And then I hope he will say some words about the purpose of this institute. And one of the activities of the institute is organize important persons, and this is why we are here. And so that's why I'd like to welcome you and ask John to introduce the institute and then introduce the guests. And don't forget, there will be a small reception after the event, so don't go home just after the last sentence of the presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Peter, thank you very much for your introduction. It's always impressive to meet a man who, with the mere stroke of the pen, transformed a piece of paper into a currency. And I've been trying to collect as many examples of your signature while I'm here as I can. Now, that's a reference to the fact, for those of you who don't know, that Peter, in addition to being a distinguished economist and head of the school here, is also a former governor of the Bank of Hungary. Now, he's asked me to say a few words about the Institute, and I would say just this. We have the following aims. We want to establish a center in Budapest for conservative and classical liberal thought, analysis, debate. And that's our first aim. But we, of course, don't want to confine ourselves to the right. We want to also stimulate debate and argument and hold forums in which conservatives and classical liberals, on the one hand, can debate important issues with their democratic opponents. And that's our second aim. Our third aim is to provide a transmission belt for the ideas here, and for people, and a transmission belt between Central Europe, the English-speaking world, and Western Europe. And today is a good example, because we're bringing here a distinguished American lawyer and economist to talk about a book that is in fact written by a distinguished French economist. And it's a book which has created a great deal of interest. I think it's fair to say that although it's been criticized by the Financial Times in particular on a particular use of statistics, even the book's critics, and the book is Capital by Thomas Piketty, the French economist, but I think it's fair to say that even the book's critics are finding a great deal to admire in it and a great deal to profit from, even though, of course, they don't always agree with the conclusions which Mr. Piketty reaches. So our aim, in short, above all else, is to promote debate. And to some extent, it's true, I think, that most Central Europeans tell me this, that the problem with Central Europe is that there's too much partisanship and not enough debate. And we think that by producing more debate, bringing people with different points of view and having serious discussions about them, that we will, in a sense, reduce partisanship. And we certainly, anyway, want to produce liveliness, argument, and criticism, and in a sense, intellectual entertainment as well. So, having said all of these things, and I'd like to just welcome Mr. Ferenc Hubin, who is a senior member of the present government, and thank you for coming. So having said that, I'd like now to turn to our speaker. Our speaker tonight is a very distinguished American. If I were to simply list his career, you would see, for example, that he's had a distinguished academic career, having taught law and economics at the Kennedy School at Harvard, among other things. If you were to look at his political career, he was in both the Nixon and the Reagan administrations. He held a senior position at the Organization of Management and Budget, which is, in a way, that department of government which is connected, concerned, and supervises all other departments of government because it tracks where the money goes. But he was also Ronald Reagan's, is it fair to say, the czar of deregulation? That would certainly, I think, cover a number of jobs you had. And finally, he was Mr. DeMuth was, for 20 years, the president of the American Enterprise Institute. Now, he took over that organization at a slightly difficult point in its fortunes. And in the course of the next 20 years, he transformed it in several ways. Economically, he took it from a debt-ridden institution to one with a large annual budget and a very significant capital balance in the bank. Secondly, he made it the central, and I never actually worked for the American Enterprise Institute and have worked for two other think tanks in Washington. So I think it's a tribute for me to say it was plainly the dominant think tank in Washington for most of the recent period, and as such exercised, when democratic administrations were in power, it exercised a steady critical influence on policy. When Republicans were in power, it first of all had to cope with the fact that a lot of its senior figures immediately moved into government positions, but it sustained a serious critical examination of Republican policies as well, because I think, as everyone is aware, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, when our people are in power, they cease to be our people, and you have to keep them up to the mark by sustained external criticism. So that was a major contribution. And he and Mr. DeMuth has, as a conservative, and I would say, prefer to describe him as an unhyphenated conservative. There are elements of neoconservatism, of paleoconservatism, of social conservatism, and above all of economic conservatism in his ideas. He is not a narrow figure, certainly not a narrow economist. Law and economics is a particular interest, but he brings to tonight's topic, and tonight's topic is a very interesting one. In a sense, it's capitalism after the publication of capitalism. Can we develop, as a result of Piketty's book and our criticisms of it, new ideas of how to sustain and advance the notion of capitalism? I think that technical failure was a nice editorial hint that I should come to the end of my remarks before the equipment fails again. So I want to say simply, Chris DeMuth, welcome to Budapest. We're delighted that we can host you. We look forward eagerly to what you have to say about an extremely important topic. Chris DeMuth.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John O'Sullivan, and those here from the Danube Institute. And thank you, Peter Akos-Bad and his colleagues from Corvinus University for inviting me to speak here this evening. I'm thrilled and delighted to be in Budapest. A few notes before I begin. If there had been a blackboard, I would have written on the blackboard the inequality R is greater than G. I want to tell people in advance for the humanists in the audience, literature majors, there are two technical things in this talk. There is R is greater than G. R stands for the rate of return on capital, and G stands for growth. And that is the essence of this book. Also, there's going to be a paragraph halfway through the talk where I use the idea of the elasticity of substitution of capital for labor, which is a really simple idea that sounds forbidding, but it's only going to last a minute. And it's a really simple idea, and I'm going to move through it. There are two uses of the word capital. When I go like this, it is capital the book. When I don't go like that, it is capital the concept, which can mean assets of one kind or another, investments, wealth, or as the author of the first capital termed it, the means of production. Now we're ready to begin. The sensational debut in the past several months of this book, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, should give heart to those such as John O'Sullivan mentioned, who fear that politics is becoming too partisan, that the blogosphere is dragging us down, that debate ought to be more about issues and less about scandal and personalities. Since this book came out earlier in the year, policy debate has been captivated by a 650-page academic treatise addressed relentlessly to the merits. The Piketty debates have shown the internet at its best and proven the worth of our capital of the intellectual kind. Let me explain. Piketty is an earnest French economist, and he has propounded a thesis that is at once sweeping and empirically complex, technically grounded, and easily grasped. Returns on capital investments, he argues, are typically higher than the growth of the economy or the growth of incomes in the economy in the modern world. And he expresses that in his simple inequality, R is greater than G. This difference is systematic. It is not a market failure. It is the successful market in action. And it accounts for the growing inequality between those whose incomes derive from capital and those who possess only the workaday earnings from their own labor and therefore can grow only at the lower G. And by the way, he estimates that over the long term, rates of return on capital are about 5% in real terms, and economic growth and therefore wage growth is about 2 to 3%. This inequality that is a result of the difference between those who earn from capital and those who earn from their own labor can be expected to increase indefinitely in the future as long as we avoid those capital-destroying depressions and wars that characterized a good part of the 20th century. It's already, in Piketty's view, reviving anti-democratic patrimonial capitalism of the kind that characterized the Belle Epoque and the late 19th century. Piketty is emphatically a man of the left. He appeals frequently to social solidarity. His analysis leads him to proposals for confiscatory taxation, that's his term, of capital incomes and a global taxing scheme for accumulated wealth. But his presentation is notably free of partisan or ideological forms of argumentation. Most of all, he argues for his position in the spirit of open inquiry, and he invites his readers to contend with his conclusions in the same spirit. That invitation has been accepted with astonishing alacrity. The great power of the internet is its capacity for high-velocity argument and intellectual metamorphosis. Propositions that previously took years to assimilate are now grasped and dissected in a matter of a few weeks or a few days. The dialogue is not only fast-paced, but wide-ranging, global, interdisciplinary, democratic, generating new syntheses that take the original position far from the author's intention, and I hope to give you an example of that before I'm finished this evening. In the past, books such as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, or Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb in 1968 could achieve iconic status with great cultural momentum and prestige just on the say-so of enthusiasts in the media and in corners of academia before the author's actual arguments could be carefully scrutinized and debated. No more. Capital is perfectly synchronized to current political preoccupations with economic inequality, but in the few months since its publication, it has generated a critical literature much larger than its own 650 pages, and in many respects, just as intellectually rich. The Piketty literature does include its share of blogosphere bombast and blasphemy, but also many deep assessments of Piketty's basic premises and arguments, and many expert evaluations of technical aspects, empirics, intermediate arguments, and even minor asides. The seriousness and the sheer density of this flood of commentary have overwhelmed efforts at partisan posturing. A good example is Paul Ehrlich of the New York Times, an eminent economist who is a strong and highly opinionated left liberal economist who spends a good deal of his time denouncing the views of conservatives that he disagrees with. He has columnized that capital strikes an historic blow for aggressive taxation, income redistribution, leaving conservatives sputtering and name-calling with nothing serious to say. But any Googler who is modestly earnest about the matter and diligent can see that that is entirely false. Right-of-center economists such as Martin Feldstein and Tyler Cowen and others have offered substantial, detailed, highly meritorious criticisms. More important, many of their criticisms also appear in the reviews of left-of-center economists such as Robert Solow, Lawrence Summers, and even Krugman himself, not in his political column, but in a long review in the New York Review of Books. The arguments of these and other scholars have had to run their own critical gauntlets. They have been recited, analyzed, criticized by thousands of bloggers and commentators, some of them highly sophisticated in their own right, that bring their own insights into the fray. That the Piketty discussion has departed from intellectual formulas is a testament to the power of accumulated intellectual capital. 2 centuries of academic endeavor, mostly in Europe and the United States, has produced a wealth of specialized knowledge in economics and other social sciences. It includes theoretical and empirical investigations of every conceivable subject, written according to professional norms that are, for the most part, apolitical. Piketty is American-trained. He got his PhD from MIT. He comes from the academic world, and he knew that his work would be subject to academic scrutiny. Capital is not das Kapital. He is at his academic best in looking into the trends in economic inequality and their relationship to his interest in capital accumulation by the very rich. He presents a trove of empirical data, much of it original and assembled by him and close colleagues over more than a decade of painstaking research into French tax records from the mid-19th century, taxation in Sweden at the turn of the century, etc. He has some sharp words for academic economists, but he respects their procedures. He has augmented his book with a vast internet posting of detailed raw data files for evaluation by students and by skeptics. Some economists and journalists have questioned the accuracy of some of his data. Others have compared his findings with those of other studies, studies that use other data sources, studies that incorporate the redistributive effects of taxation and income transfer welfare programs, studies that examine income among individuals rather than households. Households have been getting smaller. There are more people living alone. One person tends to have a lower income than 2. That can introduce some noise into the data. All of these other reviews show much less pronounced trends in inequality, and some of them show none at all. And finally, others have looked at the distribution of consumption, not what comes in, but what people actually spend on themselves, which is a different and in many respects, not all but many, a superior measure of economic welfare. And they find that the distribution of consumption has not grown more unequal in recent decades. Piketty has stood his ground, replied to his critics, pointed to new research that bolsters his side of the arguments. I think that his view has been considerably compromised, but that's not an important part of my talk this evening. I simply want to rest on the proposition that Piketty's account no longer stands alone. But what difference does it make? Nobody really doubts that the modern economy has produced some spectacular fortunes, and no one really doubts that median and average incomes have grown much less fast in recent years than in prior decades. Piketty's more original and important contributions concern the causes and consequences of those developments, especially high returns to capital and what we ought to do about them. And here, he is strikingly less empirical. He often resorts to broad and conclusory assertions, sometimes garnished with the plots and dialogues of 19th century novels, Jane Austen, Balzac, and always hedged about with numerous academic qualifications, caveats, acknowledgement of other views. The result is a remarkable composite of the French style of artful philosophic declaration with the scientific style of tentative hypothesis and skeptical inquiry. Thus, for example, capital never really says what is attributed to it. It never says that the capital share of national incomes is bound to increase and lead inexorably to gross inequality. Here's what it says. It says that capitalist economic development does not necessarily lead to greater equality, as we had often supposed, and that might instead lead to greater inequality. Growth and inequality have gone together in the past. We should take seriously the possibility that they are doing so today and might continue to. But despite these bows to academic caution, he's obviously attracted to the strong form of his assertions, the ones that have got him so much attention. His use of the algebraic notation, the inequality, R is greater than G, suggests, and is intended to suggest, a universal constant, like the relationship of the speed of light to the speed of sound, not just an educated guess. And he speaks of it leading to, quote, an endless egalitarian spiral and the recreation of patrimonial capitalism. His strong assertions have drawn criticisms that cut much deeper than the demurs to his ideas about trends in economic inequality. Exhibit A, and here we are, is his contention that capital can be substituted for labor very easily through machinery and other labor-saving improvements in the organization of production. That contention is expressed in his estimate that the elasticity of substitution of capital for labor is greater than 1. His number is 1.2. What that means is very simple. It means that any increment of capital investment results in less than a proportionate fall in the returns to investment. So you can invest another unit of another 1,000 or 100,000, and the returns will not fall very fast. The result is that the capital share of the economy can continue to grow. And that is the source of his R is greater than G as a universal constant rather than just a mild tendency, in his now famous maxim that the past devours the future, meaning that continued capital accumulation drives down the labor share of the economy and creates a permanent class of self-perpetuating rentier overlords. But the standard account, well developed in the literature, is to the contrary. It is that capital investments encounter diminishing marginal returns. that tend to equalize R versus G, a central proposition of economics. So the best opportunities for labor-saving improvements are exploited first. Further investments earn lower returns, both because capital becomes progressively more difficult to find ways to substitute for labor, and because there's more capital around chasing these diminishing, more elusive opportunities. At the same time, more and better capital leads to some degree to greater productivity. Workers are more productive with the better capital, and this is reflected into their increasing wages. In this, the standard account, the growth of investment capital it tends to lead to falling capital returns and increasing labor incomes, so that the shares of capital and labor will tend to be stable rather than divergent. The standard account is well supported among all economists. The idea of the elasticity of substitution is that it is less than 1, meaning that returns tend to fall more than proportionately as investment increases, and there are many strenuous, bitter arguments in the academy, maybe in this building, over whether the elasticity is more or less than 0.6. Piketty's outre estimate is the reason that economists of all stripes, left and right, have given a wide berth to his R is greater than G. Here's Jason Furman, chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. It is actually ambiguous whether or not R minus G would increase or decrease as a result of lower growth rates. In fact, many standard economic models imply that R would fall by more than G, so that lower growth rates would lead to a reduction, consequently pushing in the direction of less inequality. Lawrence Summers, who was Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton and Chief Economic Advisor to President Obama, has said essentially the same thing on his idea of easy substitutability. He says, "I know of no study suggesting that measuring output in net terms, the elasticity of substitution is greater than 1, and I know of quite a few suggesting the contrary." The idiosyncrasy of his approach has profound implications for his policy recommendations. He proposes very high taxation, which he calls, as I've said, confiscatory, and a new global structure of surveillance and taxation of accumulated wealth, which he frankly admits is utopian, but urges us to get started on now in little steps, such as a EU-wide program of taxation. The justification of these policies is that they're necessary to avert a dire social and political calamity resulting from this growing capital dominance at the expense of labor. But if that threat is actually contestable, uncertain, highly qualified, then extreme urgent measures to counter it lose a lot of their appeal. But there's much more. For there's a more fundamental problem, that his premise is at war with his prescriptions. For if capital investment is powerful and elastic, as he says it is in his growing inequality argument, then the economic costs of high taxes on capital to counter it become enormous. The first principle of efficient taxation is to avoid taxing factors of production that are highly elastic in order to minimize distortions in the private economy and deadweight losses. To an economist, the best of all taxes is the tax that Mary and Joseph paid, a head tax that does not change according to any economic activity on your part. Economists who want high taxes on capital returns always rest their case on low estimates of the elasticity of capital for labor, and Piketty's high estimate has boomeranged, has blindsided them. Even within the accepted ranges that I mentioned, that Lawrence Summers mentioned, very small increases in elasticity translate into huge benefits from reducing capital taxes. The tax economist Kevin Hassett has noted that if Piketty's estimate is taken seriously, it is the strongest argument ever advanced for moving comprehensively to taxing only consumption and leaving all savings and investment to work their magic entirely free of taxation. Piketty's blasé about these matters because he believes that much of income on capital is unearned windfalls. In particular, he thinks that the very high compensation paid to many corporate CEOs and their growth relative to the wages of lesser executives and workers often amounts to absconding with corporate earnings in collaboration with cozy boards of directors. This is a result of the so-called agency problem or agent principle problem, which many students will be aware of in corporate governance, that says that tight-knit insiders can exploit diverse and far-flung outsiders, that is, the equity investors, who remain passive and uninformed. But here he's simply opinionizing. He is content to observe that it's hard to really assess the real economic contributions of these highly paid CEOs. Here he's ignoring another rich, established economic literature. We know that there's a significant agency problem in the management of large corporations, but we also know that the globalization of markets has significantly amplified the value of successful corporate strategy and executive leadership. And here is the one fact of this literature that is unavoidable. CEO compensation in privately held corporations has been growing at least as fast, probably a little faster, than their compensation in public corporations of similar size and scope. In a private corporation, there's no agency problem. The shareholders, the equity holders, really are in charge. They're sitting right there at the table. They're backing their salary and other decisions with their own money. If CEO compensation was being artificially inflated by defects in the market for CEOs of public corporations, these private firms would eagerly bid the salaries down. They don't. In fact, they often bid them up. They have to know something that Piketty does not know. Finally, Piketty is at his weakest in the relationship of private wealth to government power. He gives much, much too much weight to the enduring power of large personal fortunes. As many people have noted, there is in fact significant turnover in the ranks of, for example, billionaires from decade to decade. If you look at the Forbes list of international billionaires from the 1980s, and you take their wealth and you multiply it by, let's not even give them Piketty's 5%, give them 4% a year. Just have them put it in a bank or a mutual fund. They don't have to do anything fancy, just earn his 4% on investment, and look at where those investments would be today. They would have climbed up the rungs and be higher up today's billionaire list. In fact, a large number of them have simply disappeared, presumably because of philanthropy or bad investments or dispersal among heirs or simple squandering. They're replaced by nouveau billionaires that were not there in the past, from Russian oligarchs to rags to riches Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, many of whom have fortunes that are about to face the same secular erosion. Secondly, Piketty asserts without much elaboration that large concentrations of wealth distort democracy. He doesn't really say what he means, but what he seems to mean is that large people with large fortunes use them to skew the electoral process and obtain unfair favors from the government. But I know this at least in the United States. I suspect it is true in Europe as well. Very rich people provide tremendous support to political parties and causes of the left as well as to the right. My president, President Obama, devotes an enormous amount of his time to fundraising among the ultra-rich in Hollywood and Miami and San Francisco. Our second richest American, Warren Buffett, is a left liberal Democrat and one of our staunchest advocates of highly progressive taxation. There are also, of course, many conservative and libertarian billionaires, but the danger of a protectionist cabal that seizes the government for the benefit of a unilateral program for the rich requires some proof that is still forthcoming and would have to contradict a good deal of casual evidence. Many billionaires also devote vast sums of money to education, public health, poverty alleviation, and other apolitical good works, many of them public goods that overlap with what government does. I don't know how effective Bill Gates' foundation has been in fighting malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, but I am certain it's a good thing that that fight is being waged on multiple fronts with competing strategies, rather than by a single strategy pursued by a government agency for whom malaria fighting is an exclusive preserve, which would be the consequence of Piketty-style confiscatory taxation. He sometimes comes close to saying that it's irrelevant what use is made of the resources extracted through his tax schemes from the rich. It is the confiscation itself and the elimination of private alternatives to government power that is the main purpose. He does say we could use the revenues to pay down government debts, but this is an interesting twist. He favors debt reduction for political reasons. He thinks it's unhealthy for government to be financially indebted to the citizens it represents. And then he adds in a delicious twist that his tax proposals would actually amount to a government debt default, with the default targeted on the bondholders who are very rich. Third and finally, he is uninterested in the consequences, in the mechanics of government, and really oblivious to the dangers of government power, the dangers of government power being an age-old problem. Practical questions are not interesting to him. How do we actually tax wealth? Taxing wealth means taxing unrealized capital gains for which we don't have an objective market measure such as income or consumption. How do we tax capital, the most mobile resource of all, that can move easily from jurisdiction to jurisdiction at his very high rates before his global tax authority comes along? But worse than that, having emphasized the agency problem in corporate governance, he has nothing to say about the vastly more serious agency problem in political governance. This, too, is the subject of a rich academic literature going by the names of institutional economics and public choice, which try to analyze, and again, it's not a partisan or political matter, the inherent deficiencies and corruptions of large government organizations and the advantages of cohesive pressure groups in commandeering policy and government power for their own advantage. The term given to the problem is rent-seeking, and it's ironic that Professor Piketty, who's concerned about a rentier class of the established rich, has nothing to say about the rentier class of those who live off of government power. The governments of every advanced democracy are profuse with protectionist policies that benefit groups that go far beyond his patrimonial capitalists: farmers, unions, public employees, teachers, retailers, exporters, importers. On these problems of government and how they would be affected by his huge increase in government power, he offers only this, I regard as comically bland statement. Before we can efficiently organize public financing equivalent to 2/3 to 3/4 of a nation's income, it would be good to improve the organization and operation of the existing public sector. Good, but not mandatory. Policy debate has not been good for Capital, the book, but the book Capital has been very good for policy debate. Despite its shortcomings, it has many strengths that I could mention, but I want to home in on one. Despite its many shortcomings that I have summarized, the book has done one great thing, and that is to direct attention to the importance of capital ownership and capital accumulation. It does not come close, in my view, to showing that capital accumulation threatens to cause an endless spiral of increasing inequality. But along the way to trying to make that argument, he does offer numerous, highly detailed examples of capital returns substantially outpacing the growth of the economy and wage incomes for considerable periods of time. At a time such as the present, when economic performance is poor to middling almost across Europe and the United States, but corporate profits are sky high and the stock market has been soaring, Piketty's illustrations have struck a nerve. Now that the first wave of critical commentary, the literature, has sorted out the book's strengths and weaknesses, its most important lesson is coming into view. A powerful, although as we shall see, unintended case for a capital revival in a world that needs such a revival more than it knows. The West's capital accumulation of the past several centuries is immense. It is now omnipresent, and it has become widely assimilated, all to the extent that it is largely invisible and easy to take for granted. As Piketty puts it, for much of the population, capital is an abstraction. This accumulation includes, of course, physical capital, highways and ports, power and water and communications networks, plants, machinery, appliances, commercial and residential buildings. But it also includes, and more importantly, many kinds of intangible capital, intellectual capital of the kind deployed to such effect in the past 4 months in the Piketty debates, and many others from literature to accounting to computer software. Institutional political capital, such as large bodies of statutory law and common law, and the very ideas of the rule of law, constitutional democracy, property rights, the competitive market, and finally, social and moral capital, such as the family and church, charitable and other cooperative associations, and the bourgeois commercial virtues of work, thrift, innovation, continuous improvement, and the gradual progressive extension of trust to strangers. Much of the physical capital and much of the intangible capital that I've mentioned are public goods. They're freely available to all who are living today. They produce benefits that many of the beneficiaries do not see directly. Even the hard private physical capital is much less visible than it was to past populations because of urbanization and the extreme division of labor in modern society. Amazon and Google and Federal Express have gargantuan physical plants behind their mobile apps and their delivery trucks that few of us ever see. The result is that we have become more inclined to live in the moment, less conscious of the need to continuously provide for the future as the past has provided for us. And there's much to be said for this spirit of temporal self-reliance. As the economist Deirdre McCluskey of the University of Illinois puts it, if Scotland is trying to become Holland, then capital accumulation is how to do it. But, she advises, it's much better to go with the thrusting, creative aspiration of the kind that has created Silicon Valley and the internet, with economic returns 1,000 times greater than those of compound interest. It's a great attitude, but it depends for its success on an infrastructure of continual capital accumulation. And here we have problems, and I need to explain that the problem I'm describing is a problem I regard as a problem of government and politics rather than a problem of society, speaking broadly of the societies of the West, of Europe and the United States. In fact, the ownership of capital has grown tremendously and is being managed well by ordinary households. I'm going to use statistics from the United States, and it's the richest big country, so I think that this is probably extreme, but I think it's only somewhat different than those of other nations. In the United States, over half of the equity capital of the stock markets in the United States is owned by average workers through the medium of pension funds and other diversified investment accounts. 45% of American households own mutual funds. The middle class, which is basically not as rich as the top 10%, but everybody from the middle up to that. The middle class in Piketty's Belle Epoque owned about 5% of the capital of the United States economy. Today it owns 25% of a vastly bigger, 16, 17 times bigger physical plant. That's not enough for Piketty, it's not enough for me, but it is a very big change, and it is progress along the lines of equality mentioned in terms of the ownership of capital. There's a lot of loose talk in the media about how people are going broke on their credit cards. People find ways to borrow money on their homes, and they go out and splurge and get terribly in debt. They are squandering money on current consumption, and this is a very bad thing. There is a book that will come out next month by a professor at George Mason University in Virginia that demonstrates that that is not true. This is, again, America, but average middle-class households in America borrow money exactly the way well-run businesses borrow money. They borrow money for the purpose of durable assets and for smoothing bumps between income and consumption, and they tend to borrow within their means. So I think that the private culture of capitalism is in pretty good shape, despite our wealth and some of the invisibility of capital that we've seen. But I do think we have terrible problems in modern government. With rare exceptions, today's government finances social insurance, medical care, pensions, unemployment assistance, not through capital accumulation, but through income transfers that discourage savings by both taxpayers and by recipients, and thereby significantly, we know, suppress investment. Through a plethora of loan subsidies and guarantees, and through its own deficit spending, modern government encourages and practices and sets an example of incontinent borrowing to pay for current consumption. Exactly what people are saying ordinary people are doing with their credit cards, which amounts to outright capital depletion. And it relies on a financial system that is highly leveraged so as to excuse banks and other large financial institutions from performing their essential social role of absorbing investment risk. If Piketty is right that capital returns consistently exceed economic growth by a very large degree, all of these policies are perverse in the extreme. But even if he is not, even if he falls somewhat short of that, he has certainly shown that we ignore the role of capital at our peril, and that our preoccupation in government policies in merely shuffling slower growing labor income around among current workers and consumers and retirees, and borrowing from the unborn workers of the future is highly impoverishing. Capital, properly understood, is a call for recapitalizing our public policies. The place to begin is in social insurance. There's nothing wrong inherently. It's not evil, it's not fattening, it's not immoral to pay for these programs from current taxes, even current taxes on labor income, so long as the amounts provided are small, they're safety nets, and as long as the population is growing. And there's nothing even wrong in paying for these social welfare programs from borrowing, as long as we're doing so on an emergency basis to get through temporary bad times, such as those following the collapse of 2008. But none of these conditions applies to us. Our old age pension and health care programs promise to provide significant retirement income, not merely safety nets against hardship, significant income support, and comprehensive medical care. And I'm not talking about medical care in government systems for all of us, but providing for the extreme medical costs of the care of the elderly. Expenditures that would otherwise be financed by savings and investment and capital accumulation. Our unemployment insurance systems are increasingly providing permanent support for growing populations of the long-term unemployed. All of these things, given the size and the nature of the expenditures, it would be much better, as Piketty demonstrates, I believe is not too strong a term, if these were financed by capitalizing the amounts, by investing and drawing off the investments for each successive generation of retiree cohort, for example, rather than by simply taking the money on a year-by-year basis from those who are employed, and thereby, in the absence of tax increases, limiting the growth to the growth of labor wages. However, there's something else involved, and that is the combination of falling birth rates and increasing longevity. This has made pay-as-you-go retirement finance completely unsustainable. These programs were created in an era where the ratio of the worker to the retiree was 15 to 20 to 1. We are now in a world where it's 3 to 5 to 1. We cannot do this forever. What we are doing in the meantime to try to keep these obsolete systems going is borrowing for the future. That's simply delaying the day of reckoning and making things, at the cost of making things much worse when it arrives. We've gotten this far with income transfers for our social insurance programs only because we have actually accumulated so much capital wealth in the population. Again, I'm assuming that America is not extreme, but somewhat extreme. But in America, the pension programs for a large part of the population are only about half of what they will be living off of because they have been doing their own savings. Piketty realizes all of this, and when he gets to it, he has 2 pages of response that are the strangest pages in the whole book. He says he understands that capitalizing our pension and social insurance programs would make much more sense. He's just been explaining that for several hundred pages, but nevertheless, we can't do it. Stop. There are 2 reasons that just stand in the way that are showstoppers. One is the transition would be very expensive. If we started taking people's tax payments and instead of giving them to the current retirees, invested it in real capital assets and held on to it for the retirees, quote, an entire generation of retirees will be left with nothing. And these people can expect to be very annoyed at the fact that we're leaving an entire generation of people without their promised retirement income. And he says that there is no simple solution to this, and therefore that the idea is, quote, totally unthinkable. This comes at the end of a book where he's been talking about taxation of 80–90% of incomes, producing floods of trillions of dollars into the government coffers, which could be easily used to finance this transition. In any event, the transition is not a function of capitalizing our pension systems. It's going to happen anyway. The demographic changes that are already in store ensure that we are not going to be able to continue to support retirees from taxes on the incomes of people that are currently working. We're going to have to move to something else. He's made a very good case for moving to a capitalized system. And if its returns are as much higher as what we have, that would be a good return on investing it wherever we got the tax revenues in supporting a generation in the retirement that they had come to expect. Secondly, even more amazing, he says, well, the problem is the returns on capital are higher, but they're very volatile. They can go up and down, and you would never want a retiree to stake his whole retirement on one individual investment. It would be irrational to bet everything on a roll of the dice. This is silly. There are many ways that one responds to the volatility of capital returns. One diversifies between stocks and bonds and local investments and far-flung investments. This is conventional in mutual funds. And finally, and more important, there is the government safety net beneath any of these programs, which can be counted upon to be expanded in the case of a real economic downturn such as we've had in the last couple of years. That he turns on his own arguments so dramatically is something that that has an explanation. There is a long tradition on the left of hostility to ownership of capital. The idea of capitalizing pensions has actually been a project of the center-right for the past 20 years. It sounds paradoxical that those who are animated in their political beliefs by concern for average people, working class, the poor, should oppose such an obvious step forward, but there is an explanation for that. The original Marx, I think his statue is around here somewhere, in Das Kapital, who first identified the extraordinary role of capital in a society, which he called the means of production. His solution was that government should own and manage the means of production itself for the benefit of all. That turned out to be pretty hellacious and tyrannical in practice. Nobody wants to do that anymore, of either the left or the right. But what happened afterwards was that the left lost interest in the ownership part. One reaction would have been, we don't want the government to own it, it's going to really mess things up badly. What we want to do is disperse capital ownership. We want much more widespread ownership in society, so it's not just the rich, so the average man can actually own the means of production. But that's not what they did. What they did was turned from ownership to control. They got the idea that why don't we just leave ownership alone? It's very risky, trials and tribulations, it can be an impossible nuisance. So we'll just leave the ownership where it is, but then we will use government regulation and taxation to extract the returns when they arise. And as these arguments were developing, it was the progressive era, the early 20th century, when we were actually developing for the first time administrative mechanisms for measurement, regulation, and taxation that we never had before. But we've now had a century of experience with the welfare state. And a lot of it is wonderful and admirable in many respects. It is a jewel of contemporary civilization. But we see the perversities much more clearly than anybody did during the progressive era. These are not perversities of left-wing, of right-wing ideology. They're problems that we can all see, and I've mentioned several of them that are ironically strongly anti-capital accumulation and anti-widespread capital ownership. So now we have to have a second book on capital, making some of the same arguments in more sophisticated ways, but still opposing the idea of promoting widespread capital ownership. So here's my agenda. I'm going to come to the end here with a pretty rapid run through my promised capitalist manifesto. I think the proper response to Mr. Piketty's book is to take his analysis very seriously and to strip away from it the sort of naive statism and to have a program for much wider distribution of capital ownership in ways that the state cannot mess with, plus a recapitalization of our public institutions. There are three parts to this. The first is the welfare state that I've mentioned a little bit already. The second is private finance, and the third is public finance. As for the welfare state, as you may have guessed from what I've said, I think that we should capitalize our pension systems. I would have a two-part system where we had a minimum income paid for not by taxes on current workers, but paid for by government revenues in general, that is a floor, and I would have automatically managed, taken from people's paychecks, automatically enrolling them in professionally managed, diversified investment accounts and held on to throughout their lifetimes. The benefits of financing expenditures for health care among the elderly because those amounts tend to be even greater than income, than earnings would be even greater. Where we do have public pensions, I want to capitalize them. I want to fund them fully. In the United States, we have pension funds public pension funds for teachers, policemen, firemen, at the state and local level that are underfunded by $4 trillion. The government has said, we're going to have capital assets. They're going to be standing behind your retirement. It's a guaranteed benefit. Here's what you're going to get. And they assume that they are going to be getting in perpetuity 8% a year returns on average. Well, it's higher than Mr. Piketty's returns, and it's higher than any of them have been able to earn. The use of pension assets for public problems when they come along is a long story in the United States. We've seen it in many governments across Europe and across Latin America. You create these big holdings of capital, the government has problems, and it makes use of them. We do it in America all the time. Detroit, which is now in bankruptcy court, has been doing it for decades. I would like to go in the opposite direction, and where we have assets that have been accumulated for people's pensions, to give those assets to the individuals and not have the government have effective ownership over them. In the United States, in our Social Security program, for decades, the payments during the baby boom generation have actually been higher than the benefits paid out. So there's actually been accumulated in the government a shadow financial account of $5 trillion. It's essentially an IOU from our Treasury Department, which took the money and spent it on battleships and farm supports and whatever it was doing, courts. So it is a debt from the Treasury to the Social Security Administration. I would like to take that IOU and divide it up into all of the people that paid the money in and print up nice-looking bonds and send them to the people. Let them have it. Let them do what they want with it, so it's not subject to government discretion. It makes more people capitalists, familiar with the idea of capital ownership and responsible investors. But I would take the Piketty argument all the way to consumption taxation, essentially eliminating all taxation of savings and investments, removing all of the temptations that we have when we intermix government and private ownings. In consumption taxation, you take your income for the year and you subtract everything that you've saved and invested, and you pay tax on the difference. As long as you save it and invest it and it grows, if you give it away to charity, if you're a Bill Gates, you don't pay anything on it. But as soon as you're actually doing something for yourself, that's when you pay a tax. And you have something that's very easy to measure. And the effects upon capital accumulation in any society would be fantastic. Secondly, when it comes to private finance, I've attested to my view that households tend to be actually pretty smart in the way they manage the other side of the capitalist equation, which is borrowing money for the future. But all governments have programs that subsidize private expenditures, and don't do it through outright subsidies, but use the financial system. For example, in the United States, we have now, the government has $900 billion in student loans. We have a vast program for encouraging people to buy their homes with financing that the government supports. What you see in all of these programs is distortions of the idea of real finance. They have very, very easy terms. In the United States, whenever an election is coming up, the president comes out and says that, remember that what we were going to charge for student loans? Well, we're going to take the charges lower. President Obama did it last week. They look a lot more like grants. Make them grants. Do not corrupt people's ideas of the nature of investment. When you do that, when you make things cheap and easy, what you end up doing is you end up encouraging people to borrow not for investment and capital accumulation, but for consumption. The worst sinner of all however, is the government itself. Public borrowing, public debt, was everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world of market economies until about 1960, 1970. It was for responding to emergencies, war, depressions, natural disasters of one kind or another. Deficit financing for John Maynard Keynes was something you did in an emergency, in bad times, and when good times came around, you paid it back. He was a budget balancer over the long term. There aren't any Keynesians anymore. Everybody in the political world believes in perpetual deficit financing all the time. Sometimes not very much, but we do it every year. And in some countries, such as my own, we do it to a fantastic degree. And the growth of conventional, regularized, normalized deficit spending coincides exactly with the growth of the transfer state, where the nature of government expenditures has been moving from the creation of public goods to providing income to individuals. Much of that is used in consumption. You cannot finance consumption over long periods of time out of borrowing. It is becoming clear that to almost everybody that deficit spending is going to have to be controlled, and deficits brought down. The welfare state is going to have to accommodate, and the ideas that I have given for if you're subsidizing expenditures of one kind or another, do it open and outright, and we should capitalize a good deal of our what is now part of our welfare state spending. We'll do that, but in the meantime, with debts as high as we have in, I'm not talking about Hungary, but in many areas of Europe, and certainly in the United States, the debts are so high that we are very vulnerable to crisis. We're very vulnerable to a situation such as Greece's, where an external shock came along and made a pattern of practice that was bound to come to an end, at some point come to an end very, very rapidly, with violent results and huge pain and suffering on behalf of large populations. Speaking for my own country, it will be decades before we get our debts down to reasonable levels. A war, a natural disaster, an epidemic, another financial crisis, something that requires the government to borrow a lot of money quickly to provide a solution is something that we would be very, very hard-pressed to accomplish if it came anytime soon. And the fact that this is well known tends to attract trouble of the man-made kind. The idea of social insurance, it was not a capital idea, it was a risk-spreading idea, that the government, by spreading risks among large populations and by overcoming public goods, collective action problems, could reduce the risks facing ordinary people and reduce the net risks of society as a whole. But when we introduced into that equation the idea of borrowing money for current income transfer programs, we introduced this idea that we could provide greater benefits to current taxpayers than taxes to pay for those benefits. We built this self-recreating machinery, and the result is that government has lost its ability, at least for the time being, to provide the most important kind of social insurance that government is responsible for, which is responding forcefully to emergencies that ordinary citizens themselves cannot respond to. So getting ourselves back into a positive capital position where government can perform its highest function is probably the most important recapitalization that we have to face. Thank you very much.
Chris, you're going to be answering a few questions. Do you want to do so from there or from here?
Right here.
Okay. In that case, so what I'm going to do is ask people to raise their hands. I'll call upon them, and we will bring the microphone forward so they can ask any questions.
Hello. I'm just wondering, is everything you said, is it all applicable to Asia, which is supposed to be the sanctuary of Asia coming up? And I know in certain businesses, certain gentlemen there are growing very rapidly. I'm thinking of Alibaba and Tencent and Masayoshi Son. Are they increasing the so-called inequalities? What is the repercussion of this book in Asia, per se? That's the question.
I don't know how the book has been received in Asia, and there are many stories in Asia, and I wouldn't want to try to characterize them all at once. I would say that China provides a vivid example of the fact that inequality isn't everything. There's much, much more inequality in China than there was during the Maoist period, or before Deng Xiaoping. And it's because a lot of Chinese have become middle class, but not everybody. And there are a lot of Chinese. And so there are still a lot that are still farmers working for what anybody in the West would regard as almost nothing. But there are now large cities, and there's been an enormous... the irony of Piketty's book is that he says that inequality has been increasing, but on a global scale, we've had the biggest equalization of incomes in the past 20 years in all of human history, and China is responsible for a lot of it. At the same time, China has a finance system that is even more politicized than we have anywhere in the West, and it has massive misallocation of capital and a lot of corruption. And the smart people in the Chinese government have known for decades now. I can remember having meetings over in China on this. They've known that they cannot sustain the growth they've had with the sort of arbitrary allocation of capital. A lot of their strictly what we would regard as the welfare state, spending, social insurance, they have very, very little of. They have stronger families, which is the best, was an important substitute sort of social insurance. The Japanese are an example of a society that has gotten older faster than we have, and has made many mistakes in central banking and other areas in the past. My view is that the current Prime Minister is trying to fix them. The great dilemma of China in terms of fixing its financial system is that unlike the Western countries, it's going to get old before it gets rich. I know we think it's gotten rich, but it's still not in standards that we're accustomed to, other than in pockets of wealth. And the society as a whole is going to face some of the dilemmas that we are going to face without the capital, both tangible and intangible capital, to rest upon and get through it that we do, and that will make for a good deal of instability.
You mentioned the negative effects of the recent demographic trends on the pension system. And we hear ideas mainly from Germany, but sometimes also from Hungary, that you should link the pension you get to the number or the quality of children you raise. And I just wanted to ask your opinion about this idea.
I think almost all of the advanced economies have pro-natal policies of one kind or another. We have very big, in the United States, we have very big deductions from your income taxes for every child that you have. And it's a perennial proposal in America that we increase it, and I've seen a lot of those proposals from around Europe. It seems to me, I've never heard of this proposal of yours to tie pension payments to the number of children. It seems to me that a pension being something you receive in 30 years or 40 years is a kind of an odd way to give somebody an incentive to have children today or to provide help. So I would say that that's not the way I would go about it, but I would say that a capitalized pension system would be much better. One of the things that we know from studies of many different economies is that this idea of putting a heavy payroll tax on young people just at a time when they're starting to form families and have children discourages family. We correct for everything we can, and societies with higher payroll taxes to fund their pension programs tend to have lower numbers of children. Now, a lot of different things affect the number of children that people have, but to the extent we can tease these things out, it'd be much better to lay off on the taxation of young couples that are starting a household and having children and a lot of immediate expenses, but I would do it in the immediate term, and I think that shifting to a capitalized pension system where you're still putting in money and maybe even the same amount of money, but it's your money and it belongs to you, would have positive effects.
As you say, there has never been more money in the world. People have never been richer. And all the problems you're describing are well known and well understood, and the solutions are right there. But it seems to me that the real problem is a lack of political capital. If you look at someone like Gerhard Schroeder, who effectively sacrificed himself to make reforms in Germany, which are only now really benefiting the country, and now it's leading Europe. Thank God it's there to bail out the other countries on the periphery. Have you any ideas how to address that? Because it seems that that's the real stumbling block to implementing any of these solutions.
I'm a scribbler and a talker. That's what I do for a living. And what I am doing tonight is part of the challenge that you are laying down. What really excites me about the Piketty book is that here is a man who he's a serious socialist. He's not a faux socialist or something. This guy's really a lefty, okay? And he has made an intellectual case for doing things that have these various reforms I've described. I was head of a think tank. We've been promoting these things for 25 or 30 years. And in Washington, AEI is the right-of-center think tank, but the left-of-center think tank, Brookings, we disagree with Brookings about a lot of things, but we agree on all of these things. And we've been going at it and going at it and going at it. And there's a lot to criticize for our conservative libertarian parties and leaders on this, but the essential attacks have come from the left. And it's always struck me as extremely ironic that the left would be opposed to these things, and I think that they're just, it's this long, it's just a habit of thought that goes back, and I gave a very brief review of it after the collapse of Marxism and the socialist dream, thinking in terms of redistributing capital income rather than widely distributing capital ownership. To me, it was simply a wrong turn for people on the left. So I see this Piketty book, and I'm very excited, because I think he wasn't looking for it. He was actually looking for some other things, but he found it. And he doesn't even quite know that he found it, but I'm hoping that after this debate, I wasn't just trying to give you a iteration of the debates or tell you why I disagreed with him or anything like that. I think a lot of the stuff that he said is sort of, it's like an acid bath of this intense debate, and there's going to be something left standing, and it's going to be the creation of a left-wing Paris intellectual. And I think maybe this offers us the possibility of some new synthesis, some fusion, some new agreements between left and right where we can really make some progress. So, as I was saying, I don't run for office, I just give speeches and write papers, so that's what I'm doing.
I'm Janos Horváth. When a researcher finds something that he really wanted to disprove, but in the course of being a scientist, an honest man, that's a good point. May I suggest that can we return to the very basics, to the theory? Young ones used to be about the theory. Well, the theory, your declaration at the beginning that G is higher than...
R is greater than G. R rate of return.
R is greater than G. R is return to capital, yes. And the other is return to labor. Yes. So the marginal productivity of capital is higher than the marginal productivity of labor. Very simple theoretical foundation. Now, it is questioned, has been questioned, and I am not to elaborate on it. I wonder, rather pose it in a question. Is this proposition, as you announced it, being challenged by our author, or is just passing by? And because if it is so, then follows, and let me say a policy implication, then there is some significant redistribution policies would follow. Where are they? Thank you.
He argues that returns to capital investment will be higher than the growth of the economy as a whole, the growth of labor, wage income, and that this is a permanent matter absent capital-destroying catastrophes. World War I destroyed a lot of capital. The Depression destroyed a lot of capital. World War II destroyed a lot of capital. Communism destroyed a lot of capital. So it was kind of a bad century for capital. But he has a theoretical argument that I tried to trace, which is that capital can continue to substitute for labor, and the returns to new capital we can save labor and save labor with computers all the time, and the returns never fall. So he's got a theoretical argument, and I tried to point out that that's pretty much a departure from standard economic theory, and he has an empirical argument, just that it doesn't come out of the theory, he just puts it next to it, and that is all of his data sets. And it shows that when economies started really growing in peacetime, basically, I'm going to use my years, I forget what his are, basically 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars. And that had been a period of 50 or 60 years of just constant warfare. Economies began to grow and grew pretty continuously until World War I. And he describes that as a period of greatly increasing inequality. And that's why he brings us into Pride and Prejudice, and why Lizzie Bennet has to marry Mr. Darcy. Everybody's organizing to get the people of great inherited wealth. And he says that Jane Austen had figured out what was wrong with capitalism in the 19th century. That's his view of what capitalism was. Then we had this horrible century until about 1990, and now we're not growing very fast, but we're at a time of peacetime accumulation, and the rich are getting richer once again. So he has a theory, and he's got a bunch of facts that go along with it, and some nice allusions to literature. And his proposal is he wants every nation to tax capital returns at a marginal rate of 85%, and he wants a global tax authority to tax wealth at wealth over some very high number of millions of dollars or euros per year at a level that's actually pretty high. I mean, it's like 5%. But if you tax somebody's wealth 5%, in 20 years you'd have it all. So it's actually a pretty high rate. So he wants these two big taxing schemes to avert this return of this privileged class of people that are just sitting around clipping coupons and doing nothing.
Yeah, I just wonder. So it is not labor that creates capital, but it is capital begets capital.
Yes, exactly. I went through the book, and I have it on my iPad. So a nice thing about Kindle books is you can search a whole book really, really quickly. And I'm trying to find him acknowledging that capital investments, if you're working with better capital, you're more productive, and if you're more productive, you're paid more. So, there's this other, when I was at AEI, we did a study, we said, if we're only interested in maximizing the position of wage earners at a fairly modest wage rate, what would be the optimal tax on capital? And we came up with 0. Now, that was somewhat a part of our assumptions. Capital investments can be good for people sort of in the middle of the working class, but not so good for people at the very bottom. So that's not all there is to it. But the idea that capital accumulation is bad for labor is let's just say it's very incomplete.
Thanks. This is very exciting, but we are running up against the clock. What I'm going to say is, could I take one more question? Chris will reply to it. Then he won't be leaving. He'll be staying here, and we can move the discussion from the public to the private, so to speak, or a series of private discussions. And let me ask, is there one more question? Yes, Kalman, right at the back.
Thank you very much, Kalman Póca. My question will be rather a philosophical one, perhaps, because I assume you know the theory of justice of John Rawls. Do you know the theory? Yes, of course. So he puts it actually that a system is justified on the basis that the people in the most disadvantageous situation can benefit even from the system, rather better from any other system. Now, my question is whether, do you think that the capitalism is this system that without any redistribution, capitalism could produce the justice described by John Rawls?
I don't want to sound like a too simple-minded pro-capitalist ideologue. Let me say, there's something very interesting, and I've been thinking of exploring this. John Rawls's idea, it's a very sophisticated idea, but the simple form is that the just society is the society where the least well-off person is in the best position. If we have an infinity of different societies, the one where the least well-off person is in the best position is the most just society. Piketty, his just society is where the richest person is the poorest. That's the best society. So it's exactly the inversion of Rawls. I wish Rawls were alive today. It would be very, very fun to watch them go at it. I do not think that I think that it is hard to demonstrate, and it's just really fun for a lot of bull sessions. If we have, people used to say about communism that it brings equality because everybody's a slave. And the evidence of that epoch suggests that the poorest person in a communist society is not better off than the poorest person in a capitalist society. But I can imagine people coming back and arguing it in different ways. I think that it's an inadequate conception of justice, which makes it doesn't help us solve any particular arguments. And it's because it's focusing on this extreme case. It's assuming that behind a veil of ignorance, when somehow if we can imagine ourselves with brains but no bodies and no sense of where we will be in the world, what world would we choose? And I think very few people are so risk averse that they would say, in case I'm the worst off of several billion people, I want that person to be best off. I think more people would tend to say, I want the average person to be in the best position, that sort of thing. And I think if you ask a more realistic, a question derived from a more realistic conception of justice, the domination of a free market order with a welfare state, and kind of the sort of mixed economies that we have in the modern world. I want it to myself. I think it'd be better if it were a lot less mixed than it is. But if we just take capitalism as we know it, warts and all, it strikes me as more consistent with the most realistic conceptions of justice that we can come up with than others that anybody, including Monsieur Piketty, have come up with yet.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think all I need to say on your behalf to Chris DeMuth is thank you very much indeed. It was a tremendous talk, and it's eliciting a fascinating debate. It's just the beginning of something, I think. We're going to be running your talk on the videotape of it on our website. But I actually also think, in order for it to do it justice, we've got to get a written version at some point, which we would definitely want to publish to stimulate debate further. So thank you very much indeed. Don't go away, anybody. There's some wine at the back, something to eat, I think, and we can carry on talking for some time yet. Many thanks indeed.